So welcome to the Ask Me Anything panel with our current and alumni Activate Fellows. I'm Rick Kempinski, our Director of Fellowship Recruitment, and I'm excited to moderate today's panel discussion. So here's the agenda for today. I will review the application timeline, and then we'll have the panelists introduce themselves. After that, we're going to open up questions from the audience. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box at any time throughout the session, and I will do my very best to get to as many of them as possible. We'll end with some next steps and additional upcoming activities that you can sign up for in the future if you have more questions about the fellowship. And our goal today is really to have our fellows share their experiences through the application and selection processes and answer your burning questions about becoming an Activate Fellow. So please make sure to use the Q&A feature again to ask your question, and I will ask it to the panelists and moderate the session. So some of you may have already seen this already on our activate.org/apply website, which I encourage you to check out if you haven't already. This year, our application will be open from September 19th through October 17th. After that, we will begin our selection process for the remainder of 2023. If you make it through that part of the process, we will be conducting our video interviews during January 2024 to select our finalists. If selected as a finalist, you will begin preparing your presentations throughout February for what we refer to as Finalist Week. As you can see, Finalist Week will take place from February 26th to March 1st, where you will present about your technology and your interest in becoming an entrepreneur to subject matter experts, as well as our community contacts who will help us determine the fellows for Cohort 2024. Beginning around April, we will notify those selected as fellows and begin the onboarding process in order for the fellowship to begin around June 1st. Okay, so the main event. I'd like to now introduce our panel of current and alumni fellows. First, we have Chris Eiben from Cohort 2020 in our Berkeley community. Next, we have Nili Persits from Cohort 2023 from our Boston community. Finally, we have Augustine Zavinavashe, who also is from Boston, but in our Cohort 2022. I think he's having technical issues. I'm not sure if he's there, but hopefully you can at least hear him. And I will now turn it over to them to tell you more about themselves and their companies, starting with Chris, and then Nili, and then Augie. So I'm also going to ask them to tell the audience what they found the most valuable part of the fellowship has been. So let me actually stop sharing the slides. And Chris, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the kind introduction. Happy to be here today. I founded Perlumi. We're a company that's working on improving yield and drought tolerance in plants by improving photosynthesis itself. I was part of the Berkeley cohort, have graduated last year, and I would say there were two enormous things I got out of the program. The first of which was I was coming out of a Ph.D., which doesn't necessarily do a great job of training you how to be an entrepreneur or a startup founder. And so the program was a super helpful way to get structured feedback and advice and to help unlearn some unhelpful things that were learned over my stay in academia that were not helping me as a founder. And then the second thing is, as a solo founder, the community was massively important. It's super hard starting a company. If I didn't have a community, if I didn't have the Activate community around me, I probably would have stopped after 6 months because it's so hard, and I wouldn't have known I was making progress otherwise. So yeah, it's a bit about me and the biggest things I got out of the fellowship.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. Nili, over to you.
Hi, my name is Nili. I have Dottir Labs, which is just being founded right now. I'm a 2023. I haven't graduated. I'm still doing my PhD. I'm working on that simultaneously. My technology is about optical sensors for large-scale manufacturing. And although I've only been at Activate for about a couple of months now, it's again, like I have to repeat what Chris said here, is like a really, really amazing help for people with more of a technical background to kind of bring them on board with all of the lingo and jargon and terms that everyone in business seems to just naturally know, and just kind of make you feel like there's a very, very, very supportive community. I've already interacted with them so much. They've helped me with so many like trivial and massive things. It's just there's always someone to turn to. It's great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Augustine. Thank you for the introduction, Rick. I'm class of 2022, and I'm based in Boston. I'm part of Eiben Bio, and Eiben Bio is enabling the scaling of the use of biologics. And the key challenge you face here is that it's really, really hard to use some of these microbe strains just because they have a short shelf life. And so we're extending the shelf life of different microbial strains. What I'd like to say about the program is that I think to echo everyone, the community has made it really, it's made it really fun to build a startup, but also at the same time made it easy. And the reason why I say this is because there always is someone who's done something, who's trying to do whatever you're trying to do it at that point in time. And that just makes it so much easier because you feel comfortable knowing that they are the people who are doing it. And so it looks super average because when you look around, there's someone who's going through the same struggles as you. And mentally, it just makes things that much simpler to achieve. And so I'd say that that's one thing I really have enjoyed over the last year. But also the other things, so things such as capital, which are always super important, access to talent. And so being an Activate company just makes it so much easier to get people interested and on board to the team that you're building. Thank
Wonderful. Thank you all for the introductions. We have a couple questions in here. The first one is, I'm going to have you all answer, is could you elaborate on how climate change related ideas fit in your strategy? It's highlighted in the website, but it's not one of the 6 focus areas. I guess that might be a question for us. I mean, I think that we work in different industries. I don't know if you all want to talk about how you individually have it related, your ideas related in your own strategies, but certainly would love to hear from the fellows.
It's not clear to me which strategy we're talking about, but I started Perlumi because I was concerned about climate change and I wanted to have a big impact on it. And if you can make plants do photosynthesis better, that means you can make the same amount of food on less land. And that means we can avoid the 8% of greenhouse gas emissions that come from land use change, which is primarily burning down rainforests to make more agricultural products, soybeans for the most part. I think Activate is broadly interested in supporting people, new scientists that are doing hard tech things and transitioning their technology into a commercialization stream. So there's room for people working on climate change. There's room for people who are working on other things that are beneficial that aren't necessarily climate change, supercomputing, new materials for new products, and so on. So yeah, it's something Activate's interested in. I would say that from a company perspective, there's kind of 2 types of climate change companies, I would say. There's companies that can only survive if they're paid for the benefits they produce around climate change. And then there's companies that can survive without being paid directly for the benefits that they do around climate change. Oh, but if they were to be paid for it, it's just, they're better. It's just more profitable for them. So Perlumi seeks to be in the latter category. But there's people out there that really believe that durable, lasting real carbon markets have started. And they're betting their company on it, but I'm not comfortable with that risk. So it's not clear to me what the strategy is around either application to get in the program or what your company is doing, but those are some thoughts.
Yeah, I think, Chris, you nailed that. That we do have an interest in climate change. I think that we are working in different industries that are listed on the website, so please check those out, of which industries we are looking for folks in particular. There's a question here about submitting an application early and whether or not it's recommended. I will say we do recommend you submit early. There's a lot of things that you need to prepare for, so you should be gathering that information early. You should be able to hit the deadline of mid-October without a problem. So the earlier, the better. It's not that it's going to get read earlier, but it is that we want to make sure that you are prepared and having all of the components of the application submitted early. I don't know if you all want to kind of go around and give advice on preparing maybe for gathering information for the application and how you prepared that yourselves. maybe Nili, if you have any advice on that.
It's fairly recent, sure. I will first admit that I am not one to prepare far in advance. But I did start looking at the application like a month before it was due, which is really a lot for me. Just to have it in the back of my mind. I think the biggest thing for me was helpful to start iterating on things, to not just, do it really a one-time pass, just ask a lot of feedback from people I trust to kind of iterate and improve it. And the only really painful part for me was the video. And I think it's just good practice to prepare and have a lot of feedback from people that have valuable inputs, not random people. It's a good preparation for becoming a founder.
Great. Augie or Chris, any additional input?
I think I spent quite a lot of time just like talking to people who were alums or who were in the program, and I think that was beneficial. When it comes to doing the application, I think a month is more than enough time. But having had people who've done it before, you actually learn to understand if the program fits what you're trying to achieve, and what makes sense and how to make your application better. So I think just spending time connecting with people is important.
Great. We have a question here that's asking you all to recommend a good book or resource to have most of the business lingos, words, and definitions for learning purposes. Is there any book that you went to learn or prepare to become an entrepreneur?
I did not read a book, but the Y Accelerator has an amazing website with so many resources. And I highly recommend people to check it out because it just gives a really great overviews that not too in deep. And they also have a lot of references for if you want to dig deeper into things. So for me, that was for now enough. Maybe I'll get to book reading in the future.
So I read Disciplined Entrepreneurship, 24 Steps. And it was like super helpful. It just gives you some context of what you need to know and like learn. And also I think Pillar VC also has like a good podcast on important things, especially in the biotech space. So if you're in biotech, I would try find that online.
I wouldn't worry so much about the lingo and so on. Like, you'll pick it up. It's not super hard, and you'll talk to people. And a lot of the lingo and a lot of like the high level strategy from a technical perspective is not that complicated. It's really just figuring out what ecosystem you're in and like what facts matter and what don't. So it's not really like having a lot of theory on the business is not as helpful as you would think. And by talking to people in your industry, it'll become pretty apparent pretty fast what people are interested in, kind of like what the prices of various things are, what price points you have to hit. I did read a book that I thought was pretty helpful called High Output Management by Andrew Grove. He was the CEO of IBM. And mostly it wasn't classes on business or books about business that was as helpful as, trying to become a better manager myself, because I'd never really had to manage people when, stakes were high before. So things around learning how to be a better manager was more useful than learning a bunch of stuff about discounted cash flow things. It's worth knowing, but it's much harder to do the day-to-day management than it is to like figure out, okay, like we need to have this level of return every year to make our investors happy. They'll just tell you what that number is, and then you try to figure out how to make that much value from the day-to-day tasks you're doing.
Great. We have a question here about SBIR funding in parallel to Activate. I guess if you all can kind of talk about that in the whole fellowship experience and how you were able to learn a little bit more about the SBIR and applying to SBIR through the fellowship and the fellowship experience, and what you kind of did throughout the fellowship in that government funding space.
So I think government funding could be important. So we applied for an SBIR almost at the same time we applied for Activate. But during the program, Activate helps a lot. So they have different programming where they bring in people who help write grants. So you could technically work with them, or you could go write the grant yourself. I would advise just like working with them. Just makes it easier. They know what most grant writers want. It's pretty much the same people for the last like 5-6 years. And so they could help you be very strategic when you submit your application. I would say probably submit it as early as possible because the earlier you do it, the longer you wait, the less you need that capital and the further it takes you. So pre-seed, if you get $250,000 from NSF, that's a lot. You can do quite a lot with 1 or 2 people. But when you're now a seed stage business later on, then it's helpful, but not as helpful as the early stage.
Great. Any other thoughts from the other folks?
I can just say, as someone who's going to apply to the SBIR, we just had a panel this week, particularly set for Activate Fellows to talk one of the reviewers on the SBIR, and he was super helpful. And it's just getting to know the people, and there's also like the shared experience of people who've submitted, who failed, who've succeeded. It's great. There's just that resource and a lot of helping community.
What I would say is every company is different, and every technology that people are working on is at a different phase, and the companies that are at different phases. So some companies, SBIRs, make a lot of sense as a route to fund them, and other companies, the SBIR is actually a distraction. So I wouldn't just do things because other people are doing them. Like I would do things that are useful for you and your company and where you and your company are at in the life cycle. So sometimes that's SBIRs and sometimes that's not doing that at all. So it just depends on where you're at.
Great. There's a question in here about how did you decide your initial company structure when getting incorporated before joining Activate?
I had conversations with a few lawyers and a few founders before joining Activate, and because I'm an university spin out, then there was a lot of resources about what used to work in the past, what was the best for both the company and for legal purposes. There's a pretty large consensus on what's the best way to establish a company and where and in what format. It's pretty straightforward, honestly. And Delaware C Corp, just so everyone's on board.
Yeah, Delaware C Corp, any good lawyer that you're going to work with will know this. If you want to be a venture-backed company, that's not where you want to take risk. You want to take risk on science, and everything else should be unrisky. So the standard is what you want. I should mention, in the past, there have been people who've applied to the fellowship before the company was actually formed, but like it was very clear that they were going to form a company. I don't know if this is still true in the fellowship, but I actually think there's quite a bit of value if you get the fellowship not having your company formed yet, because frequently, if you're spending out of academia, there'll need to be conversations around tech transfer and conversations about, well, professors like to be associated with things, but how many hours a week can they really put into your company versus how much equity that they think they want or think they deserve, and so on. And those can become real hassles. So one of the advantages of the community in Activate is this is a common problem for teams. Something like a third to a half of the fellows have problems around this. And so there's plenty of expertise and people to talk to. Well, what did you do to get things straightened out with tech transfer? What did you do to figure out your relationship with your professor as you transition, all that stuff? And it's good to know what market rate is. And a community is a good way to discover what market rate is.
Let me just say that I did this. I was going to incorporate, and then once I got the Activate Fellowship, I decided to wait. And I'm really, really happy I did. I got such great advice about so many things, and now had a, from every point of view, just I switched the law firm that I wanted to work with for something else. And there's like so much help that you can get. If it's not crucial that you incorporate and you can wait with it a bit, then you should do it.
I agree with Chris and Nili. And if you have to do it, please vest your shares over 4 years as well.
All right, there's a question here around co-founder versus solo founder. So I don't know if you all want to talk about your decision of why you decided to choose your path, and some advice you might have from your experience working with yourself and with your cohorts.
So I'm a solo founder. I think it just came down to timing and fit. I wanted to start this company and I had a particular vision, and I didn't know other people who were like available at the time who I would have brought in at a co-founder level. And so I decided to found it as a solo founder. Being a solo founder is statistically harder, and solo founders seem more stressed out to me than founders with a co-founder. But there's no shortage of, like, the main way that very early startups fail is co-founders splitting up. So I wouldn't like pick up a co-founder because statistically it sounds nice, or because someone tells you like you need a co-founder. It's like if you know that person, or if you've met that person, or if you're willing to spend a year looking for that person to co-found with you, and you find the right match, awesome, do it. But don't force something that's not going to work, because it's just gonna cause problems, and problems don't get smaller, right? Like they just get bigger as the stakes get bigger, as you have more employees and more money in the company. The stakes are all higher. So if you can find someone, that's great. If you can't, don't force a bad fit.
I'm a solo founder, and I guess like similar to Chris, I just wanted to get the company up and running, and I didn't want to spend the time. So my hope was that whilst building it, I would find someone who I would connect with, and then if we connected, then they would ultimately join me and become a co-founder. So I didn't really go out and say, hey, for the next 3 to 6 months, my sole job is to find someone to co-found this business with. And the reason why I didn't want to do that is because sometimes it's like, it's sort of like 3 to 6 months is not nearly enough time to get to know someone like really well. And I think only through truly working with someone and knowing how deeply they care about the mission, can you really know if this person wants to spend the next 5 to 10 years of their life working on that problem. And that person may show up, but we're just going to continue building it for now.
So I am currently a solo founder, but I wasn't. I had a co-founder for a year. And surprisingly enough, what ended up happening was that as soon as we got the Activate kind of moving along, that co-founder had decided that this isn't for them, which was a very, very good decision to make before things get really complicated. So it was a good thing. I also learned, I learned a lot from that experience. And I mean, I'm lucky to have kind of been able to end it in a very nice, friendly way. That's hardly the standard, sadly. I am looking for a co-founder. Again, I think I feel very similar to Augustine and Chris here, where I'm not actively searching very, very hard for a co-founder. It's always in the background, and I'm talking to people and I'm open about looking for a co-founder, because I feel like I would do a better job if I could, focus on some aspects and all of them at the same time. I think from my experience, it's a very, very, very important decision. And one can liken it to a marriage. This is a person you're going to spend so much time, mostly with problems. So you need to make sure that that person can communicate, and that you communicate well together, and that you share a vision. And even if all that still happens, it's still going to be rough. So something to consider.
A quick comment. I know at least one Activate Fellow who basically, after they applied, and got the Activate Fellowship, they applied for SBIRs, and then the other thing they were doing full-time was looking for that co-founder, because they knew that they wanted to stay more on the technical side, and they spent like a year, and they finally got someone, but they got someone who was a rock star, and it changed the trajectory of the company tremendously, because this other person had had a successful exit. They were in a similar space in the past company. And so they came in, and then it was much easier for them to raise capital because this person had that reputation. So like, when I came into the program, I thought, great, I have 2 years and some money to work on science so I can hit some milestones, and I'll create this magical graph that I'll show investors, and then they'll throw money at me because my graph is so great for the science I'm doing. My experience was that the 2 years in the fellowship, just going out and talking to potential customers or talking to people in the ecosystem and talking to advisors and finding advisors, was way more valuable than spending the time in the lab pipetting. Yeah, it can be game changing for a company if you can bring the right person in, and that's a totally viable strategy.
That's great. You kind of touched on this, Chris, but there's a question in here about sort of what you find the main benefits of the program are for each of you. Like maybe you can go around and just talk about some of the components of the fellowship that really you find are really beneficial to and have been beneficial for you in your experience, in your fellowship experience.
I can answer this first. The best return on investment you can have is to stop doing things, because you get 100% of the resources back that you were dedicating to this thing. So if you're doing stuff that doesn't make sense, you should stop doing it immediately. But how do you know that your thing doesn't make sense, right? Like in academia, the implicit understanding is if you go out and read enough papers, you can deduce the answer. And that's not true for a lot of startup stuff. Like the answer isn't reading a book a lot of the time. Like books are helpful. I'm not saying like burn all the books, but like going and talking to someone and being like, if I built this, would you care? Right? And then they'll say like, yeah, because you're nice and you're smart and you're interesting. And then you're like, okay, so like, would you sign a letter of support for my SBIR, which would cost you 0 effort for me to build this thing that you say you care about? And they're like, I won't do that. Well, that's super useful information. Like, don't spend 5 years of your life building something people don't want. And so, yeah, having the fellowship prod and push me to go out and talk to people was super valuable. Because if I hadn't, I'd be working on something today that would be dead in 2 years, because once I delivered it, no one would want it. And so, yeah, that was super valuable and exactly the opposite of what academia had taught me by accident.
I think for me, it was this whole idea of like being able to move faster. So if you ever have any question or problem, there always is someone who's done it before. And so you can quickly iterate. And so I think being a part of Activate has just helped me accelerate at least like the company's trajectory, be it in managing teams. And so there is a class where we go through how do you best manage people. There are people who've been managing people. So if you have any issues, they let you know how they've dealt with it, and helps you bring and build structure to your organization much faster. When it comes to even raising capital, you have VCs come in, they talk to you, you have people who've raised capital before. This just makes things smoother and easier for you. And also team building. I think I mentioned this earlier on. You know how to recruit people. You know the terms that people are also getting in that space. You know what is market. You also have access to people who've been in some of these different companies that a lot of climate companies are trying to push into. And so having that industry experience and expertise is invaluable in understanding if what you're building actually makes sense. Maybe you're solving the right problem, but you're not thinking about how to integrate your system well. And so having those initial conversations are super important to getting there. And so I think whatever you need, you can always find it. The question is asking the right question. If you can ask the right questions, then I think Activate will be super valuable for you.
I think something that was very surprising and very encouraging for me was that Activate is a personal fellowship. So there's like two separate parts. One is you are supported individually as a founder, which is amazing. And then your company is also supported with like a very initial like capital, and there's access to more. So you get kind of very initial capital, but it's still like for someone who's just starting a company, has never done anything, that's like everything, right? You don't have to risk everything, your life, just to do something, which is, you know, it's amazing. And then personally, you get the support as a founder, and then the company gets support from the community because you're constantly being prodded. I was like, why are you doing this? Since feedback is super important. I feel like it's a great way to learn how to, you know, grow as a founder, as a technical leader, but also try to grow the company. There's like Activate allows you to do both things, and they're tied, but like even if you end up realizing that your company or your idea isn't going to work, you're not going to get kicked out of Activate. You're still going to be supported as a founder. They're still going to teach you how to take technology and make it into a product, which is, you know, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to learn, and it's worth it.
Awesome, thanks. There's been a lot of questions about sort of what stage of technology development an applicant should have before applying to Activate. And just that's a great frequently asked question that's on our website as well. But we will consider applications for projects ranging from early concepts that have not yet been fully validated, all the way to projects with pretty early prototypes. Most applicants have established an early proof of concept supported by data that the innovation works. But projects already projects at full scale commercial development are way too advanced for the fellowship. You wouldn't need us. It should be really early development. I don't know if you all want to talk about sort of where you were when you applied and sort of how well the fellowship got you to where you wanted to be, or has been getting you to where you want to be.
I think so. We had some initial proof of principle. This is stemming from my Ph.D. at MIT, and so that gave us some good initial validation. But we really hadn't talked a lot with like potential customers, so companies that could potentially buy our product. I think through Activate that helped us get there, and now this has really accelerated our trajectory because we know exactly what we need to build. And so just like hitting the KPIs that people do care about, which most of the times in academia, you probably focus on like only one KPI. You really don't think of integration. And these are really important things if you're trying to bring in a new component in an industry.
When I applied, I had some graphs showing some enzymes worked. And I had a model that I thought was good on techno-economic analysis. It turned out that model was not great. But I had honestly attempted to do it and think about all the unit operations and attempted to price them out. And that's where I was. I feel that it used to be if the company hadn't raised, it was like, I think it was like 1.5 million or 2 million, something like that. You could apply to the fellowship. I forget what the numbers are now or if those were the correct numbers, but I actually think that's like a reasonably good guideline. If you've raised more than that, you're probably too far along for the fellowship. If you're before that, you're probably about right. At least for the people who are accepted into the program, it's usually not the level of technical development that is their core problem. Usually their core competency is tech development. And usually the trap people get into is they think that a technology is a product, and it's not. And then the next trap they get into is they think a product is a company, and it's not. So I wouldn't worry. I mean, you have to have an idea of what you want to do. Like, don't apply with no concept, and you need to have like a way to do it. But I don't think the application is super long. Like when I applied, I think it was like 6 pages. There wasn't a video, but I might at that time. But my guess is the video is like 90 seconds or 2 minutes or something. It's going to be short. And they're not going to give you a bunch of hard times about, your background's not nice or the editing is bad. That's not the point of the video. And if you make it to the phone interview stage, I think the year I did it, I think everyone who got to the phone interview stage got feedback, whether they advanced or not. And that feedback is super useful because it's really hard to get feedback from VCs or other groups that's honest, because they don't want to say no in a way that makes you mad that you'll never work with them in the future. So they say no in a nice way. But that's hard for you to turn into progress or learning or growth and Activate. If you get to that stage and they tell you this is our feedback, like, I mean, don't make it unfun for them. Don't like argue with them, but actually try to like receive the feedback and use it. So I would apply. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, you're going to be applying to a lot of stuff. So get used to applying.
Great. Does anyone want to give their sort of overall experience to the application process? You sort of brought this up, Chris, also in your response now, but does anyone else want to talk about your experience through the phone interview process and then through finalist week? Like, what does that look like? How can you, like, what advice do you have for folks to be thinking about it and preparing for that as well?
I'm happy to share about that. So I think what changed for me, and I think this echoes what Chris said as well, is that technology isn't a product and a product isn't a company. And of course, I'm just very, very early on. But one of the important things about making your pitches and is to have that in the back of your head. What are you actually doing? The technology is a great start, but what is the application? How do you feel this moving forward? And that's a very kind of big mental shift that needs to happen. And it's good to start that early. I think for me, once I made it to the finalist, it was like, oh, wow, okay, cool. And then I looked at my slides and I'm like, I think they're decent. And I got some feedback and they weren't decent at all, it's great to learn, right? So at some point you reach this point where you think you're doing well because you have a presentation that you've probably done at conferences if you're spinning out of academia, and you feel like, oh, this is solid, and it's not at all because it's not what they're looking for. So I think for me, the entire process of getting to finalist week and all of that just helped me really fine tune what people are looking for. And I didn't really have access to that before, despite doing all these entrepreneurial stuff. And I don't know, probably a lot of you have done iCore and whatever you're trying to do. Yeah, so I feel like I'm very lucky. I'm an Activate fellow, but just going through that process, if you're just starting, is going to teach you so much. So just do it.
If I've learned anything about being an entrepreneur so far, it's that it's best to be whatever you are and just own that thing. So a lot of questions that happen because people are coming from academic environments and they're like, oh, what do I need to put in my grant to get the grant? And that's not the way I would really try to think about your whole company, right? A lot of times, a lot of our lives have been spent trying to make committees happy with us, which means trying to remove all the sharp edges and trying to make it so that it's very, non-offensive in various ways. But for making a company, it's much better to have a very small number of people super love you and super love what you're doing and have a lot of people not like you than to have everyone kind of like you, but nobody actually is that gung-ho about it. So whatever you are, whatever your company is, just own it and apply with that. And if Activate's not the right fit, just keep doing this with VCs, with other groups, with angels. Eventually, you just need to find, the 3 or 4 people to say yes in key ways, and your company will move forward. So I wouldn't think about this as gaming the system like a lot of people do with grants and other things. It's really figure out what you're about, present it as best as you can. And then this is just one opportunity amongst many to try to find whoever jives with what you are and what you're doing, and they'll get it. And then you'll be supported. So maybe it's Activate, maybe it's somebody else, but gaming the system questions, I'm kind of, it's not the way I would recommend doing this, but yeah.
Okay, great. Someone asked, how do you balance talking about your science and your technology versus you as an entrepreneur in your application? Like, how do you best get through that in the application? Any advice on that piece?
Someone gave me this advice, and it started as like the first thing that I did. And now I'm of course better at it. The first thing I did when I started talking about the product and the company and not just on the tech is, in my head, before every sentence I said, I was thinking best case scenario. And then I said what I was going to say. So there's a lot of different framing. So it's, first of all, like, you know, I'm an engineer. And so the first thing I think about is all the things that could go wrong and will probably go wrong. And I can't say that. I can say that honestly at some point, but not to the level I'm in lab and I'm like, nothing works and never will. That's just not the way to present it to other people. So honestly, it's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at this point. There's Nili in lab where things aren't working and I can be super, super, super like cynical and sarcastic about it. And then there's Nili, who's the founder, is like, I will get through this. This is a hitch. This is not a big deal. Gone through worse. This is fine. You kind of have to develop that switch about who you're talking to and how you're presenting it. I'm never going to tell you to lie about it or you know, sugarcoat everything. But you have to be mindful about what you're projecting, and you can always be your authentic selves. But there has to be that shift in your mindset about, is this really such a big deal because I've suffered in lab all day, or is this really a big deal because the technology is completely breaking apart? You kind of get the perspective as you go along.
Great. Anyone else with other advice on the panel?
Can you repeat the question briefly? Because I think it was application centric, or?
Yeah, application, and how do you balance you talking about your technology and your company versus you as a person and as a like your interest as an entrepreneur, and really bringing in that personal aspect of the fellowship application.
So presuming your company is very early, which would make sense, because otherwise you wouldn't be a good fit for the fellowship. A lot of investors will think of the company as you, or you and your co-founder, or you and your team. So like they're kind of very similar things to them. So I think it's reasonable to spend a fair amount of time talking about you, your motivations, why you're doing it. And a lot of early investors, when they invest in a company, they're betting on the team, and they're betting on the product and the tech. But there's been plenty of examples where the team, like a great team tends to be, or a great entrepreneur to invest in tends to be better than necessarily the product they're working on right now. So I think for the Activate Fellowship, it's reasonable to talk about yourself. When I applied, there was a section for me that had a page limit, and then there was a section about tech that was a page limit, and then there was a section about like techno-economics or something that had a page limit. So I thought that breakdown was fine. It may be more freeform this year, but if there's prompts and you have a prompt to write about for 2 pages, write about the prompt for 2 pages, and one's probably about you. So I think it'll be broken up in a reasonable way, probably.
Not 2 pages, but there are questions in the application for sure.
Please don't use ChatGPT. That's it. It's horrible.
I don't know what the breakdown is now, but when I applied, yeah, the whole thing was 5 or 6 pages total.
Yeah. Great. Can you talk about what sort of a day in the life of a fellow really is? Like, how much time do you all spend, or how much did you spend in the lab versus sort of the networking and the learning and the building of the company and the hiring? So I guess sort of talking about all of that sort of split. What does that day look like for you, or what do days look like for you?
I think it progressed and changed over time. So initially, the learning phase, you join the fellowship, there's a lot to learn. And I think, so every Thursday is, one Thursday is to your office, the following Thursday it's national, and you spend a lot of time just like learning. And through those learnings, you then connect with other people. Then you have follow-up emails. Initially, you get a lot of requests from VCs trying to understand what you're up to. So you can decide to take the calls, you can decide not to take them, but it's a great way to like learn. And then once you're in this phase where you've like learned quite a lot, now you go into actually building the business. So once you start building the business, you start spending more time on the business itself. If you have a co-founder, if you're a CEO, you're spending most of your time on the organization, the vision. If you're a CTO, you're spending more time on the tech. If you're solo founder, then you're balancing both things at the same time. And also the good thing with Activate is once you get to the second year, a lot of the learning has occurred now. So they expect you now to be spending more time at your company. And when you do need help, then you go out, you reach out to all the fellows that are there. So that we have a Slack channel with current fellows and also alums. It's a great way to connect with people. But we also have a leadership council where we have people from different companies, VCs who are willing to help and work with Activate companies. That's a good way to work. And so it basically now just depends on how you see best to manage your time and how you can optimize accelerating your company's growth, which is very specific and dependent to every individual.
I would say in the program, there tends to be, I mean, there's all sorts of people, all sorts of companies, all sorts of places in the company's life cycle. But broadly speaking, I think fellows kind of fall into one of three categories. So if there's a team of 2 or a team of 3 that applies, there'll be sort of technical people doing technical stuff on that team. And then there'll be someone whose job it is to interface with the outside world. Usually they were a technical person and now they're learning how to interface with the outside world. So if you're one of the outside world facing people for your company, representing your company, a huge percentage of your time probably is going to be ending up talking to people outside of the company. If you end up being a technical person and you have a team where you have an outside facing person, a lot of your time is going to be spent in, dealing with things inside of the company. And then you have solo founders, which are kind of this unique category of like, I see that there's like a lot of swings. So like you spend a bunch of time doing outward facing stuff, get resources, get money, get advisors. Now you have resources, money, and advisors. And now you got to focus on like, okay, I got to organize the team and the company to make sure that we're making progress. You do that for 9 months and then you're like, oh, I now need 9 months to raise money. So you tend to like flip more back and forth as a solo founder. Whereas if you had a sort of someone who's doing the CEO outward facing role and someone doing a CTO inward facing role, it's you still have these, swings on seasons and you have due dates and things move around, but your life will be more, if you're the CEO, your life will be more outward facing in general if you were paired with a CTO who will have a more inward facing role. When I first joined the program, COVID had happened. So I literally could not go into lab to do pipetting. And the fact I couldn't go into lab was super good for me. It was super painful. I hated it. I felt like I was wasting my time, and talking to people was by far the most important thing I could have been doing. And the fact you could just do Zoom calls with people and that was fine was great, because you could have meetings with people in Europe and you could crank out meetings in a day. And so, yeah, I think a lot of fellows who spent 0 time in lab in the first year, I think some of those people got the most out of the fellowship as opposed to people who spent a lot of time in lab in the first year.
Great. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'm going to end the webinar with some next steps. But the next question is there have been some questions about how Activate helps you all raise VC funding. Sort of how does that work? And I guess what's your experience in the fellowship with raising money?
I guess I can go first. So we haven't raised an outside round yet, but we're fortunate enough to get some grants. And I think Activate does a tremendous job in helping companies raise outside funding. When it comes to VC capital, I think like there's so many touch points with VCs when you're at Activate. So the first touch point is once you become an Activate company, a lot of people will reach out to you. And if you're ready to raise a round, I've seen friends who've used that momentum and have raised capital. There's also a showcase where Activate companies go out and present what they're doing. The first, I think September, it's in SF, so it's a great place to go raise capital. Investors show up. If you have your story nailed, you can definitely quickly raise and close a round. I've seen people do it. Then there's one in Boston in around February. I think it's around March. That's also a great time. It's solely for the incoming class. You can present, a bunch of investors show up, and you're looking to write checks. And so if you have the right story, you've connected with them, then you can raise capital. But also along the way, right, there's venture partner capital. And so that allows you to start building a relationship with some of these VCs. And if you're delivering on some of the milestones that you said you're going to do, they're more likely to then follow on with the investments that they initially make. And so there are multiple ways to go about it. But also the classes that you take will help you think about fundraising, pitching, storytelling, and how to structure your deck. And what I really liked is the VPP capital actually helps you start building a data room, putting all the information you actually need to raise a round. And so when you actually go out and raise a round, you have everything in place for a fast turnover, which is super important.
So I think the biggest thing, so I haven't raised a round. I'm about to start my first official raise. I was on grants for a long time. It's really hard to go out to a VC and ask them for a couple $1 million and have them say yes the first time you've met them. Like, would you do that if you had millions of dollars and you're going to invest it? So getting to know VCs and talking to them way before you need money sets you up for success. And so every phone call, every incoming I got from VCs while I was in the program, I just took it, even though I had grant funding, even though I didn't need the VC funding right now. Then you get to meet people, and some of the VCs, you know, won't send you anything back afterwards, and some of them will be like, hey, we should talk once a quarter, maybe talk once every 6 months. Some VCs are like, hey, check back in 2 months before you start your raise, and you start to figure out like who's actually interested and who's not. So just yeah, all of that income was coming was super valuable. And then Activate will give you actual feedback on your slides or your pitch. And again, it's really hard to get that feedback from VCs because they don't want to rock the boat and be mean. Because if they say something negative about you and 5 years later you're super awesome as a founder and you have a second company and it turns into Facebook and you won't return their phone calls because they were a jerk to you that one time and you remembered, they don't want to risk that. So a lot of times it's hard to get real feedback from them, but Activate will tell you these are, you know, this issue's, you know, we think this slide could be improved, or like your team slide isn't just a thing you put there because people put team slides there. Explain how your team members are uniquely capable to make your vision real, right? Things like that. So yeah, both of those were super helpful.
Great. I think we're almost at time, so I want to make sure we get to the last step. So before we do, though, I want to go around with the panelists and just give any sort of parting advice or anything that maybe didn't come up in this questions section that you want the folks in the audience to know. So why don't we start with Nili, and then Augie, and then Chris.
I think if you're in any type of doubt, if you want to be CEO, a CTO, a founder, if this is even going to work, still do it. This will teach you a lot about yourself, about what you can become, and it's definitely worth the effort on so many levels. I think I would have loved to hear this advice before applying. I was skeptical, and I can't be enthusiastic enough now to kind of express my gratitude and how awesome this fellowship is.
I think I'm going back to what Nili said earlier on. The thing is, the fellowship is not, success isn't building this massive business. Success is you figuring out what you want to do with yourself. And so right now you're like, hey, I want to build this like amazing company. Then a year in, you decide to pivot. That's totally okay. If you decide to go into another industry, venture capital, it's totally fine. And so I think you should do it. Definitely apply. And I think there's a lot to learn. And I think for Activate, it's if you don't do it now, you can always do it in the future. Maybe 10 years from now, you take your learnings from what you did at Activate and you go and build that startup that you really wanted to.
I think the Activate Fellowship's been super important in developing me in my career trajectory. Like, I want to be an entrepreneur, which usually means being a serial entrepreneur. And I just take the long view on this, because being an entrepreneur is really hard, and like you'll have good days and bad days. And on bad days, you know, you're sitting there and you're like, oh my God, is this ever going to work? And that's really hard. But if you take the longer view, it's like, okay, well, what did I learn from today? Right. And so I would apply for the fellowship, and maybe you get it, maybe you don't. But what did you learn from it? And then apply to the next thing. Maybe you get it, maybe you don't. And you just keep doing that. And that's just kind of this, like, you have that worldview and you just get a little bit better every day. And 10 years from now, you'll have this enormous network of people that you know, and you'll have all this knowledge. And this is just a piece of that. So just, it's going to be hard. But if you're learning, then after 10 years, you're going to have all the stuff. So I'd go for it.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you for all of that great advice to the panelists, all the great answers, and everything that you've given. And thank you to all of the audience for the great questions. Just want to kind of end the session going over a couple of next steps for you. We have a couple of other application events happening. If you missed our general recruitment webinar earlier this month, or the end of July, we have one coming up on August 21st. We encourage you to attend that. Though I saw a lot of questions in the chat asking very specific questions about the application and about some advice. So please attend that and get those questions answered as well. We also have office hours, so more of a smaller group conversation and questions, get your questions answered in a smaller way on August 23rd. And we'll have bi-weekly office hours after that. Through the application closing. We encourage you to check out our website, our fellowship page, as well as our FAQ page. A lot of the questions that you all asked are outlined on that FAQ page, so please check that out. If you did not get your question answered today, it's probably and likely on there. You can also learn more about other fellows and alumni and their companies on our website as well at the activate.org/fellows. And please be thinking about these things, whether or not, like, what community you're thinking about applying for, what your technical vision is, if you want a co-applicant or a co-founder, and then how this fellowship is going to benefit what you're looking for to get your project and company successful. And then finally, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us at apply@activate.org, and also check out our job opportunities at Activate. And also there's a list of other job opportunities for our fellow companies as well online. So thank you all for attending today. Thank you again to our panelists. Have a great rest of your day.